When Lando Norris steered his McLaren car across the line to win the final race of the 2024 Formula One season, he did more than chalk up another routine Grand Prix victory. He also kicked off a celebration that had been 25 years in the making. Lando Norris's victory in Abu Dhabi in December clinched the coveted title known as the Formula One Constructors' Championship for McLaren, a first crown in 26 years for one of the most storied names in all of motorsports. And still, McLaren remains the only team in motor racing history to accomplish the triple crown of victories at the Indy 500, the 24 Hours of Le Mans, and the Formula One Championship. The champagne-soaked celebration that followed stretched from the top step of the podium to the McLaren garage, where the team's American CEO, Zak Brown, led an impromptu rendition of "We Are the Champions" to the Kingdom of Bahrain, whose sovereign wealth fund owns a majority stake in the United Kingdom-based team. But some 4,000 miles away, it also brought a glimmer of satisfaction to a 77-year-old Englishman with a bald head, a stern demeanor, and a deep love for the color grey. His name is Ron Dennis, and over 30 years as the visionary leader of McLaren from the 1980s to the 2010s, he built what may be the most dominant racing team the world has ever seen. I don't know him personally, but in this video we will find out how he did it, based on a book, The Formula: How Rogues, Geniuses and Speed Freaks Re-Engineered F1 into the World's Fastest Growing Sport, and an article published in a prominent American newspaper. Enzo Ferrari was drawn to Formula One for its speed, but Ron Dennis came to Formula One with a different purpose in mind. He saw a Formula One team as a way to make money. Ron Dennis would turn that radical idea into a billion-dollar business empire. His introduction of modern corporate practices to a sport that was still operating as a cottage industry upended Formula One, transforming a ragtag racing team based in a dingy industrial park on the outskirts of London into a blue-chip automotive conglomerate involved in sectors from electronics to corporate communications. Ron Dennis was a high school dropout from Surrey, England. He arrived in the sport in 1966 as a 17-year-old with no money, no formal qualifications, and no background in motor racing. How he managed to land a job as a Formula One mechanic is a mystery and remains mildly astonishing. But what Dennis recognized earlier than anyone else was that Formula One was at an inflection point. As the sport of Formula One hurtled into the 1970s, it was about to enter a more complex and significantly more expensive new era. What had once been a pursuit for gentlemen racers and amateur gearheads had quickly transformed into a technical, scientific and engineering problem, one that would soon require advanced aerodynamics, cutting-edge technology and a couple of ginormous turbo engines just to make it to the starting line, which meant that the most important race in Formula One was now the scramble to secure a financial advantage. And long before he oversaw the first of his 138 Grand Prix victories, that was one race Ron Dennis understood how to win. Ron Dennis said of his philosophy, "From a business point of view, losing money means your company is failing, whereas making money means your company is succeeding. And I want McLaren to succeed. Always have, always will." To do that, Ron Dennis needed investors. In the years since Gold Leaf Tobacco became the first company to slap its logo on the side of a Formula One car in 1968, Formula One had experienced a sponsorship boom. By the late 1970s, brands were falling over themselves to grab a slice of the sport's irresistible mix of glamour, danger, and unbridled testosterone. Ron Dennis, a straight-laced figure whose lips are set in a permanent sneer, did not embody all of those qualities, but no one in Formula One history would prove so adept at harnessing the power of corporate partnerships to achieve their ambitions. For me, image is key. We can't win all the races, but we can always look the best, Ron Dennis said. Under Ron Dennis, McLaren became the benchmark for presentation. Possessed with a fanatical attention to detail and an obsession with cleanliness, his punishingly high standards were instilled into every facet of the organization. At a time when most teams still had to remind their mechanics to sweep the garage floor, Ron Dennis brought a sign writer to the circuit to touch up the paintwork on his cars between sessions and instructed the team's truck driver to park in the paddock so that the names on the tires all pointed in the same direction. Everything reflected his eye for detail. Even when the team won a race, Ron Dennis demanded his employees maintain stoical composure in the pit lane. He said, "When you see a doctor delivering a baby, you don't see him jumping up and down." To many inside motor racing, a sport which likes to think of itself as sexy and dangerous, Ron Dennis's approach seemed clinical, bland, and nauseatingly corporate. But sponsors absolutely ate it up, and in the 1970s, no sponsor was bigger than Philip Morris International. In Ron Dennis, the tobacco giant found a man who understood corporate branding so instinctively that he might have been born on Madison Avenue. Together with John Hogan, the Marlboro marketing director, Dennis devised a document that became known as the Book of Sponsorship, carving up a race car's bodywork for the first time into different sections, each with a different price tag, so that multiple sponsors could each have their logos emblazoned on the same car. So when Dennis came to them in the fall of 1980 with a plan to enter his own Formula One team, the suits at Philip Morris knew they had to be involved. The problem was that Marlboro already had an exclusive commitment with the McLaren F1 team, a former champion now floundering at the back of the grid. As it turns out, Ron Dennis had a solution for that. "How about if I buy McLaren?" Ron Dennis blurted out. Hogan wasn't quite sure how to respond. It was like the local pharmacist suggesting he launch a takeover of Walgreens. Hogan asked, "How would you like to go about that?" During his years in Formula One, Ron Dennis has been called abrasive, egotistic, aloof, and arrogant, but no one has ever accused him of being subtle. Ron Dennis answered, "You tell them if they don't sell me 50% of the company, then you won't sponsor them anymore." That was all it took. The newly rebranded McLaren International, backed by Marlboro and with Ron Dennis installed as team principal, was launched in the fall of 1980. It is no exaggeration to say that no one else could have pulled off such a maneuver. It relied on all the qualities Ron Dennis brought to the table: his vast ambition, his business creativity, his tenacity, his negotiating skill, and his clarity of vision. But more than anything, it came down to the fact that long before anyone else, Ron Dennis recognized where the sport was headed. He saw how all the crucial elements of Formula One, racing, technology, finance, branding, and the commercial possibilities formed one great, big, virtuous circle. And at McLaren, he set about engineering that circle with the same zeal he once lavished on race cars as a trainee mechanic. His attention to detail went into overdrive. The company headquarters in the town of Woking in Surrey were remodeled into a state-of-the-art workspace that combined the decor of a five-star hotel with the clinical purposefulness of a hospital. Everything from the temperature, 69.8 degrees Fahrenheit, to the lighting, to the humidity on the factory floor was precisely calibrated. Ron Dennis even began pumping in different fragrances in his bid to create the optimal working environment. The color scheme was one area where no experimentation was permitted. The McLaren offices were uniformly grey, a color that Ron Dennis believed conveyed a sense of smartness and professionalism. He said, "It is no accident that most suits are grey." While other teams gradually came to see the importance of corporate partnerships to their bottom lines, Ron Dennis was now exploiting them to accomplish specific strategic objectives. United States aerospace giant Hercules agreed to construct a carbon fiber chassis in exchange for a small logo on the nose of the car. The engine was supplied by a Saudi-born French entrepreneur named Mansour Oje, whose investment firm Technique d'Avant-Garde, bankrolled the entire design, development, and construction of a bespoke twin-turbo V6 engine that Dennis had commissioned from Porsche. In return, OJ received a 60% stake in McLaren and naming rights to the tag Porsche engine. Dennis had changed the calculus of what was required to compete in Formula One, upping the stakes to a level that most of his rivals were simply unable to match. They had mocked him for bringing his briefcase to the pits and for expressing himself in the manner of a business studies handbook, talking about global positioning, vertical integration, and layered management. They were not laughing when McLaren left them in the dust. In his first season at McLaren, Ron Dennis delivered the team's first victory in 4 years. In 1984, Ron Dennis clinched his first world title as the tag Porsche engine propelled the team to 12 wins from 16 races. Dennis, at that time only 37, was the youngest team principal to win a championship in almost 20 years. By this stage, however, Ron Dennis no longer thought of himself as merely the boss of one Formula One team. Those people were hobbyists. In his mind, he was closer to a captain of industry. He even began to dip his toe into different fields of business, teaming up with OJ again in 1985 to acquire a luxury Swiss watchmaker. The brand would become known as Tag Heuer. Ron Dennis later said, "If you asked me what I wanted written on my tombstone, I'd say Ron Dennis 1947 to so and so, one of the world's greatest entrepreneurs, not anything to do with motor racing." Ron Dennis was still pretty good at the day job, however. By the late 1980s, McLaren was the dominant force on the track, the benchmark for technical excellence, and a pioneer in the field of sponsorship and marketing. It began to look as if there was nothing that Ron Dennis could not do, which is exactly when he decided to put that theory to the test. For the 1988 season, Ron Dennis executed a sequence of moves so radical that they bordered on downright recklessness. He ditched the tag Porsche engine that had delivered 26 victories and 3 world titles. He assembled the most combustible driver pairing that Formula One has ever seen, and he hired a new chief designer, leaving the development of the team's car in the hands of an eccentric South African with a fondness for floral shirts, rock and roll music, and lightweight carbon fiber. Individually, each of those moves was risky enough to derail his McLaren juggernaut. Together, they added up to the most audacious moonshot the sport of Formula One had ever seen. By all rights, it should have been an epic disaster. The decision to switch to Honda engines was so abrupt that 4 months before the start of the 1988 season, the MP44 didn't even exist. There was no prototype, no blueprint, no basic design concept, nothing. Many of the McLaren engineers had already come to resent the presence of Gordon Murray, the team's new design chief. There was no question that he was a brilliant designer who pushed the envelope of what was possible in Formula One, but he was also a madcap personality who fit the austere corporate culture at McLaren like a pair of flip-flops would fit a 3-piece suit. And resentment was probably a generous description of the relationship that existed between the team's two drivers. Alain Prost, a bushy-haired Frenchman whose cerebral approach had earned him 2 world titles with McLaren and the nickname The Professor, was firmly established as the team's lead driver. For the 1988 season, he would be joined by Ayrton Senna, a man who needs no introduction and who at that time could not accept being the secondary anything. Given all of this upheaval, it was hardly a shock when pre-season rolled around and the MP44 was nowhere to be seen. The car still was not ready. McLaren just about got it together in time for the final day of pre-season testing. Prost was first up. As the Honda engine roared to life and the car lurched away, many of the McLaren engineers were quietly bracing for catastrophe. 10 minutes later, they could not believe their stopwatches. On his third lap, Prost was already 1.5 seconds quicker than the competition. On the fifth lap, the gap was up to 2 seconds. Everybody was looking at each other and asking themselves how this could be. It was one of those surreal moments, almost like a movie going in slow motion, Ron Dennis said. When Alain Prost returned to the pits, he gave nothing away. It was as if he just popped out for some milk. Understated as usual, he offered a few notes to the mechanics and suggested a minor tweak to the pull rod that operated the front suspension. When it was time for Ayrton Senna to put the MP44 through its paces, he was a little more effusive. After putting in a 5-lap stint, the Brazilian returned to the garage. He removed his helmet but remained motionless inside the car. An expression of incredulity stretched across his face. Finally, after half a minute, he broke the silence. He whispered, "This car is going to be effing quick." He was not wrong. By some measures, the MP44 remains the most dominant car in the history of Formula One. Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna won 15 of the 16 races, failing to achieve a clean sweep only when Ayrton Senna clipped a straggler 2 laps from the finish at the Italian Grand Prix. Over the course of the season, a McLaren car was in the lead for an astonishing 97.3% of laps raced, a record that stands to this day in April 2025. The MP44 launched an era of remarkable dominance, the first of 4 consecutive world championships for McLaren. By 1991, Ron Dennis had won 7 of the past 8 world titles and it looked like nothing could stop him. He had the biggest budget, the fastest car on the grid and the fastest driver in the sport in Ayrton Senna. In short, his sleek grey operation looked like Formula One's Death Star. Then, just as quick as it started, it all came to a screeching halt. McLaren won the Constructors' title again in 1998 but would have to wait more than 25 years for its next championship. Ron Dennis's uncompromising approach began to feel like a burden as other teams stole a march on McLaren through innovative technological upgrades and key staffers moved on in search of more creative freedom. Finally, in 2017, Dennis recognized that McLaren had lost its direction and after 36 years, Ron Dennis stepped away from the team he had built into a Formula One juggernaut. He remains, till this day, the most successful team principal in the history of Formula One. By the time McLaren secured its next championship in Abu Dhabi in 2024, the celebrations could hardly have contrasted more sharply with Ron Dennis's straight-laced era. But the most striking difference was the color of the title-winning car. When Zak Brown took over as CEO in 2016, McLaren's monochrome look struck him as a little soulless and unfriendly, so he revived an old scheme that McLaren had once used back in the 1960s. He painted the cars a bright shade of orange known as papaya. Zak Brown says, "I felt like this place was Star Wars, but we became a little bit Darth Vader. And Darth Vader is cool, but I wanted us to be Luke Skywalker." Thank you for watching.